It's time now for perspective. There are now just 11 weeks to go before the end of the year, which also signals the end of the Brexit transition period. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says this week's EU summit marks a deadline for reaching a post-Brexit trade agreement with the EU. But right now, that hope does still seem pretty distant. So what has the impact of Brexit been on the UK economy so far? And how high are the stakes going forward? My guest today is Elsa Leromain, a researcher at the Institute of Economics and Social Research at the Catholic University in Louvain. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here on France 24 today. Now, before we look ahead, let's start with a little bit of context. You've recently published a paper on the impact that Brexit's had so far on living standards in the United Kingdom. What did you find there?
So thank you for having me there today. So indeed, we published a study that looked at the effect of the depreciation of the pound that followed the referendum and what was the impact on UK households. And we sort of quantify the impact to be around £600 per year for the average households. So you might think, oh, that might be negligible, but this actually represents about a week and a half of yearly average wage in the UK.
And what were the main factors driving those findings, in your opinion?
So we see a rise in prices because the value of the sterling depreciating implies a higher cost for imported goods. And so we saw that over the scope of households, let it be rich or poorer households, they all consume a lot of imported goods, namely for poorer households, foods that are mostly imported in the UK, and for richer households, luxury goods that might also be imported.
And were these the sorts of findings you were expecting to find? Were there any surprises?
So we did expect that the effect would be differentiated across households, but we didn't really find a measured difference. Because we sort of had effects that counterbalances depending on the basket of goods that each household consumed. But we did find an interesting finding, which was that there was differential effects across regions in the UK, and especially so London being less affected than the rest of the UK. And so this just being driven by the fact that you may know that in London, a lot of people spend a significant share of their revenue in their rent. And so in our analysis, the rent not being affected by the shock, we would see that the effect in London was respectively lower.
And what about the depreciation of sterling? You mentioned it just then. Of course, there was a real dip straight after the Brexit vote. A lot of people in the Conservative Party and also some on the left saying that the pound would bounce back in time. Is that what we've seen?
So we did see that the pound sort of flattened after the big depreciation, but then we sort of had ups and downs since then. And an interesting thing, I guess, to notice that we haven't seen that the pound is now at the level that it was before the referendum, and that it still reacts to the change in anticipation that sort of was common in this long period since the referendum. And especially in September, with the announcement of the internal market bill, we did see that the pound still sort of moves around with these changes in anticipation.
Now, Boris Johnson has said that repeatedly has said that the UK is ready to walk away from talks if the UK and the EU don't come to an agreement on a post-Brexit trade deal. From an economics point of view, how damaging would a no-deal scenario be?
So a no deal or a deal scenario would both be damaging for the economy. But I think it's important to stress that the main difference between no deal and a deal is related to the fact that we potentially would have tariff because so a deal is meant to lower the tariff or set them to zero for most of the goods. But in a case of a no deal, that would mean that we would go with the UK global tariff and the EU common external tariff. So they're low in most sectors, but they're important exception that really matter for the UK economically. The exemption being agricultural products, for which we do have significant tariff if these two tariff schemes would be put in place. And also the automotive sector, that is a very important sector in the UK, that might face a tariff of 10% on some of the goods. But that being said, I think another very important concern is what we call non-tariff barriers, and that in the short run might immediately cause a delay at the border. And well, these delay being really important for the whole economic activity, especially when you think about, again, the automotive industry, supply chains of a lot of car manufacturers that are based in the UK are actually based on this supply chain organization that we call just in time, and really is based on the fact that you can have these components really circulating easily on the ground.
Now, for years,
sorry,
there's a slight delay on the line.
So obviously this.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's a slight delay on the line there.
Yeah, no worries. Go ahead.
Now, for years, the general post-war consensus has meant greater economic integration amongst global economies. But with Brexit, with the US-China trade war, are we starting to see an end to that?
So I wouldn't say that we're seeing an end to that, because if you think, for instance, about the UK, at the same time as negotiating a trade deal with the EU, the UK is trying to enhance and open up with other countries, for instance, Australia or New Zealand, with whom they're wanting to write and have new trade agreements that were not in place with the EU. But of course, I mean, there has been some concern that globalization and this whole liberalization that was sort of the big trend between the war and now sort of is not coming to an end, but being criticized. And so I guess now governments have to justify more sort of the position that they take, and that closing the borders or restricting or caring about standards is being more on the table at the moment than it was before.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. Elsa Leromain, thank you very much for your insights. Elsa Leromain, researcher at the Institute of Economics and Social Research at the Catholic University in Louvain there. A reminder now of our top headlines today.